Hey again, it's Jason at Fraser Valley Rose Farm. I'm here with another one of my videos on the old garden roses, this time to discuss the Hybrid Perpetuals. I probably would have got ahead and discussed the Portlands, except I put out a little poll and you guys said you wanted to see the Hybrid Perpetuals first, and actually that works out just great, because the Hybrid Perpetuals are the natural extension of the China roses I introduced last time. As the Chinas got into the trade in Europe, they started to make a real mess. I mentioned this last time, that the Gallicas and the Damasks and the Albas and all the other groups that were present in Europe previously were bred with the Chinas in the quest to bring in reblooming into the European roses. Well, when they did that, it made a big mishmash of ways to classify the roses. So the Hybrid Perpetuals were the answer to that. They took all of the roses that were hybrids of the Chinas and the European roses and everything else that was present at the time and dumped them into a category. As soon as they achieved reblooming, they called them the Hybrid Perpetuals. And it's a massive group and a massively influential group. Before I get into those, I just wanted to mention to you or remind you that across the bottom of the screen there should be a CC button, and as soon as I can I'll go back through the transcript of this video and I'll correct some of the Latin and French spellings of the things that I'm trying to pronounce on film so that you don't get lost with my bad pronunciation. I'm going to be right up front with you and tell you that I have a love-hate relationship with the Hybrid Perpetuals. The love part is for the roses themselves. I grow probably a dozen of them in my garden, including some of my very favorites like Alfred Colomb, Paul Neuron, Baron Girod de Laine, Souvenir du Docteur Jamain. I mean, just wonderful roses, and they've stood the test of time in gardens. Some of these have been around for 150 years now and really have proven their worth. The hate part is a little more complicated. I want to draw you back to the video I made on the Gallicas. The queen of roses that I mentioned at that time was Empress Josphine of France, and she had a certain thing about her style. You might say it was decadent for sure, possibly even informal and even towards hedonistic. There was a certain joie de vivre about the way that she lived her life that sort of changed as we go towards the next Queen of Roses. The next Queen of Roses I can identify in history is Queen Victoria of England, or the Victorian era, and it was more characterized by a formality, a modesty, a tightening of moral standards. So it gets a little bit more formal, and I have to say that it crept into the way that we enjoy roses, rose gardens, and gardening in general from the era. This is around the time that the Royal Horticultural Societies were all founded, the collections, the gardens, and the rose exhibitions or flower exhibitions were all coming into being around the 1830s and 1840s. So there's a certain amount of formality that came into this, including the Victorian style of gardening, which was characterized by geometrically shaped beds, usually squares or rectangles or triangles, formal plantings, geometric plantings of carefully placed plants. So the rose, in this case, was tamed for that era. And while the Hybrid Perpetuals began as a hodgepodge of all these different roses from the Gallicas and the Damasks, but with characters of the Chinas, and with varying heights and flower shapes and everything else, eventually they came to be shaped by their usage in the Victorian era, which included having them placed into formal gardens, pruned back heavily each year. They were characterized by tall, angular growth and large flowers for the exhibitions. The roses themselves turned out beautifully, but the carryover in the rose culture is something that I don't like much. The reason for that is because I think it's a bit of baggage that the roses carry forward even to today. Young rose gardeners or people just coming into the hobby are looking at these formal rose gardens and wondering if they can live up to that standard. They maybe don't, it doesn't appeal to them to have geometrically shaped gardens or gardens with just roses in them. And that was a fashion of the time, but it's certainly not the way that roses grow best. They complement the plants around them, and the plants around them help the roses. So they're better for mixed plantings, but that was the style of the time. Also, insofar as the rose societies are concerned, I still find that they focus a little too much, at least in my opinion, on the exhibition of roses. That tradition, that grand old tradition where you lop off the heads of the roses embalm them, put them in a funeral parlor at cold temperatures, and submit them for judging. And that can be an intimidating event. And like I say, these are grand old traditions in a certain way, and I do enjoy a good rose exhibition when I go and visit it, but I could see how this would intimidate brand new people to the hobby. Okay, with that mini rant out of the way, maybe I'll take you through some of the general characteristics of the Hybrid Perpetuals before I take you through a large number of the different examples that I have pictures of to show you. The first thing I'm showing you here is an ad from the Conrad Pile Company around 1930, and you can see that the Hybrid Perpetuals in this look a lot like the modern hybrid teas, which sort of make their natural successors in the garden. The Hybrid Perpetuals were a little more limited than the hybrid teas in their range of colors. They were a lot hardier and in general less good at reblooming and with less of that T shape to the flowers. So instead of describing them by comparison to the hybrid teas, maybe I'll just say that in general they range from white through red or almost red in their colors, all the way through the pinks. There weren't too many yellows, certainly not orange. They were very, very hardy. You can see in the ad here, maybe if you have real fine print, that the Conrad Pile Company is recommending them for planting in Alaska, which I'll leave it to our friends in Alaska to tell me if that's true or not. They were also generally very nicely scented, usually upright in character, although there was a wide range. And some of them, as you'll see in the ones that I show you shortly, were almost thornless or a lot less thorny than the original European roses. And something I didn't mention in the China video is that China roses tend to be a lot less thorny than the European roses. And so in examples like Paul Neuron or Alfred Colomb, they tend to be a lot less thorny. And now on to the roses. I have quite a few to power through here, so I'm going to go through them quite quickly. The first one I wanted to show you is my garden favorite of all time, Baron Girod de Laine, which is an almost red, quite a ruby colored rose with a white lip around the outside edge of the blooms, which just adds so much definition and charm to this rose. It's a 5-foot rose, roughly, with long stems, great as a cut flower, and beautifully scented. So for me, it's like the perfect rose. Second one I wanted to show you is actually the one that popularized the whole class. It's called La Reine, and La Reine came out around 1840. It's a sumptuous pink with so many petals that it was the one that really made the class have headway against the centifolias that were popular at the time because it had so many petals. And this really turned some heads, and it turned everybody back to breeding the Hybrid Perpetuals and sort of made them the dominant class of the time. The third one I wanted to talk about is Paul Neuron. And Paul Neuron is also very full of flowers, but stupid large flowers. When I cut the first flowers of the season, I mean, these are big, like peony big, with lots and lots of petals, very globular, very nicely scented. I will say, as one of the foibles of Paul Neuron, it is a much more vertical rose than it is horizontal. So it'll shoot up to 6 feet or 7 feet without adding too much width to the rose at all. To expand a little bit on the color and form available in these roses, I should mention General Jacqueminot, or if you want to pronounce it the American way, General Jack. Now, General Jacqueminot was the one that is reputed to have brought the color red into the modern roses. So you'll find that in the breeding of a lot of the modern red roses. Also, to show you the lighter colors, I have Paul's Early Blush, as well as Frau Karl Druschke, which I'll show you pictures here. And also, I want to show you Alfred Colomb, which just has those beautiful wavy or scalloped edges on its petals. Gorgeous. Love it in my garden. For a few more examples here, I wanted to show you Baron Prévost, which is a gorgeous deep pink, and if you smell it, has the most wonderful damask scent carried over from its ancestors. Second one I wanted to talk about was Schön Ingeborg, which is a gorgeous rose, German bred I think, that has a darker center in the flower, so a darker pink in the center with lighter petals on the outside, making for a wonderful color contrast. To get into the striped, I want to show you Commandant Beau Repair here. which is an unusual rose in that it has very pale foliage. So if it looks like the foliage is a little on the yellow side, don't feed it. I made that mistake and overfed it, but it doesn't change things. It still has that pale, almost yellowish color to the foliage, but a gorgeous rose that blooms in small flushes throughout the entire season. And last but not least, I wanted to mention Souvenir du Docteur Jamain, which is one of my favorites in the garden again. It grows in a little bit of shade, so everywhere I have a spot where I'm not sure that I have quite enough sun, I stick Souvenir du Docteur Jamain in there. It makes a climbing rose, Hybrid Perpetual. It has the darkest purple or almost velvety blooms that you've ever seen on a rose, so definitely worth seeking that one out if you can find it. Alright, that wraps up my thoughts on the Hybrid Perpetuals. I wanted to thank everybody for watching. I know it was quite a long list of roses, and if you have any questions, please leave those below the video. And because I like to leave one little tidbit of information for the back end of the video, for those who are fanatical enough to stick around for every word I say, is I wanted to talk a little bit about the breeding of the roses, because the China roses and the European roses, or let me start with this, that repeat flowering is a recessive characteristic. So genetically, for these roses to have repeat flowering, at least reliably, they have to have 2 generations of repeat flowering in them. They may have gotten some of that from the autumn damasks, through the bourbons, or directly through the Portlands, but most of that would have come from China. So if you wanted to look at these genetically, they are at least half China, and some of them may be up to 75% China. Now the hybrid teas, which are their offspring, are back-crossed to the tea roses, which is another China rose. So you could say that probably by that point, 75 through maybe 87% of the genetics in your modern roses are from China. So that sort of emphasizes how important the genetics from the China roses were to the modern roses. Thanks again for watching.